You know, we've started the open water season kind of full string, right, Brody?
Yep.
Catching some fish. So walleye season started. You catch pike, you catch bass. Now muskie season kicked off a few weeks back. We're now into the end of June, so we thought we'd start coming at you with the weekly fishing report. What are the conditions like? Where are the fish moving? What can you expect? Maybe some water temperatures.
And also, you're going to catch crappie.
And you're going to catch crappie. So we'd like to even get some feedback on some things you'd like to see. So we thought maybe every Sunday evening we'd hit you with a fishing report around the Twin Cities metro area and give you an idea of what's going on out there. So for starters, Brody, what we're doing is we're catching some fish. The bass are moving towards their summer patterns. Recently we've been catching a lot of the bass on weed lines, on deep weed lines, starting at that 8, 9, 10, 11 foot range and deeper. It all depends on where the weed line is on the lake. So depending on the conditions, whether you have clear water, dirty water, weed type, it's going to depend on where that weed line is. The weed line is a common term you hear all the time, is where the fish are on the weed line. So exactly what does that mean? It really depends on the body of water. So if you take a lake like, let's say Minnetonka, for example, or Waconia, or even like a forest lake there on the east end of town, you're going to have a weed line right on the outside of that milfoil. You can see where the milfoil is kind of matting the surface, usually in that 8, 6, 7, 8, 9 foot range, and then it drops off the edge of that. That's the weed line.
If you actually crash into the weed, you can back up.
You back up. Good point. So if you crash into the weeds, you want to back up. So he makes a valid point. So the weed line, you can kind of see it this time of year, right where that is. So you want to get off that and you want to fish the edge of that. And the way I always tell anglers to fish that is pretend it's like a wall. As anglers, what we do is we see the weed line, we cast at it, we flip the bail. What happens to your lure? It pendulum swings right back to the boat. So if this is the weed line, my hand, and this is the bottom of the lake, those fish are right here. So if you cast to the weed line and flick your bail, it pendulum swings right back to the boat and doesn't get to where those fish are. So when I make that cast to the weed line, I either pull a little line out, or before flicking the bail, just kind of give the rod one rip so the line keeps coming, then flick the bail. You want that bait to hit that weed line and drop straight down before you retrieve, because oftentimes you're going to get bit right away. So if you're fishing those outside weed lines with jig worms and stuff, that's how you want to fish it. And the tactic, that I should say, that I'm fishing, the presentation, it's just a light wire mushroom head jig. This is nothing fancy. You can get away with a 16th ounce up to, let's say, even like a 32nd, eighth maybe, even a quarter. I guess it depends on how deep or the wind conditions. So you're just fishing kind of a light wire jig. And what are we putting on the end of that? I'm using this Mr. Twister Pocket Phenom. You can use a classic type worm if you want to get something less fancy, but I use just that little Pocket Series worm. This is a little 5-inch profile. That hook would work too. It just threads on there nice and neat. It's nothing fancy. I mean, we've all fished a twister tail growing up or whatever it might be, but the jig worm is a very common theme. You're going to hear it used often. It's nothing more than just your worm situation. You can see it dangles there. You got a nice thin wire hook. That's going to work great on those weed lines for your big bass. Even your walleye is going to eat that up. So that's a jig worm. That's probably presentation option number 1 in my opinion right now on a medium light, medium action spinning rod. I use monofilament fluorocarbon. You can even use a light braid and get out there and get after those fish. That's going to work very well. So that's going to be your bass approach. If you're going to be doing the pike, let's say you're going to target some pike, trolling crankbaits right now has been really hot. You can get by with like a DT10, DT14 and just troll that on the outside weed line. Those will catch panfish too.
Yep.
So you know what the weed line is now. So now you're going to get out there with the crankbait, just cover water. A lot of pike are crushing those crankbaits. Just get after them at 2.5, 3 miles an hour. Just run it slow and get those fish. They're eating it on the bite. You're going to get some walleyes and some bass too. You can also throw a spinnerbait. We've caught a lot of fish recently with spinnerbaits in the weeds. Chatterbaits are going to catch both bass and pike. If you're going to do the walleye thing, we've been just kind of pitching light jigs. We're just pitching small 1/8 ounce jigs, nothing fancy. We've been using plastics. I'll use a 3-inch Mr. Twister sassy shad or a ripple shad or some kind of minnow profile bait. Pitch that around the emergent weeds, the weed lines again. You're going to get some of those walleyes in the evening hours. They're moving up onto the sand and the rocks. And you can use that same jig, that same lure, to put a minnow or a leech on there underneath the float if you had to. So you can put a slip float on there and fish a lighted bobber after hours too. That's been catching a lot of fish. So nothing fancy about the walleye fishing right now. There are anglers pulling inline spinner type stuff, or I should say like Lindy rigs.
Or if you actually want to catch crappie with it, you can.
You probably could catch a crappie with that. The ones that you catch are pretty big. But that's a good bass bait too. Yeah, Brody's been catching lots of fish. So for the walleyes, using jigs, we're going to be trolling light Lindy rigs, going slow for those fish on main lake structure. They kind of all seem to be relating to that outside weedland right now because they're just starting to move into those transitional period where they're starting to hit the summer pattern. We're seeing water temps peak into the 70s, surface temps, and those fish are starting to do what they should be doing. So, and then last but not least, the panfish. I mean, we're out there chasing panfish. The panfish anglers are catching, excuse me, big sunfish and crappies, and those fish, just like the rest, are moving onto the weed lines. So we're out there fishing them with tube jigs and twister tails. I'll even start to deploy maybe a light drop shot for some of those bluegills and crappies. You are still finding some fish by the docks, but it seems like the bigger ones, the consistent bigger fish, have slid into the weeds or on the weed line. Right, Brody? So what are you going to catch this week?
The cat crappie.
Brody's going to catch a crappie this week. Maybe we'll catch a crappie. Maybe we'll share a picture of him catching a crappie next week. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest of the fishing report this week. Weed line's the key term. Get out there in the weed line. Start fishing deep. It's sometimes tough for anglers to grasp, but if you become a good deep water angler, you will catch more fish, more bass, more pike, more walleyes, more panfish, more of everything if you fish the weed line. So get out there, get after it, have some fish, have some fun, and we'll talk to you next week. What do you think, Brody?
Yep.
Sounds good.